just going to say,
I just say Sibiya is getting a pass. You can drop it.
good morning. I think that's the way it goes. Celebrating Africa Day, which of course officially is tomorrow, but we'll get a head start on the rest. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the school this morning. My name is Adrian Saville. I'm a professor at the school, and I'm the director of the Center for African Management and Markets, which was inaugurated in September of last year. The purpose of the center is to do exactly this, to bring like-minded, common-purposed, similarly ambitioned people together to connect us, to network, to give us the capacity to build, to connect, and to do, as the slogan, the tagline of the center goes. I'm not going to present, I'm not going to hog the podium. My purpose here is really just to welcome you and to thank you for your time and what will soon be your contributions this morning. We have a wonderful lineup. I also won't steal Andile Khumalo's thunder, who's done me the honor of hosting this morning's panel. Thank you, Andile. So I won't introduce them. I'll leave that to Andile, but we have a fantastic C-suite lineup on the panel this morning, and we have C-suite in the room. So thank you for your time, your interest, your attendance. In welcoming you and introducing you to this panel, I guess I'm in some way the odd person out. And if you look at the demographic, it's not for the reason that leaps out at you. It's that we have two classmates in the form of the VC and the CEO of Sanlam Emerging Markets. They were classmates. And we have two classmates in the form of Andile and Pile, who were classmates at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So classmates, the stage will soon be yours. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Ian and Tess, for making this morning happen, to Howard, the Director of Marketing of the school, for getting this event into the spectacular shape that you see this morning. The title of the panel, of the discussion, is about a cause for enthusiasm. Why should we be excited? And in the South African landscape, I think it's fair to suggest that after a tough decade, it is hard to be enthusiastic in the current circumstance. Yet here we find ourselves located in the second fastest growing region in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, for the last 15 years, grows 2% faster than world economic growth, and is only outpaced by Southeast Asia, where India and China lead the way. And then on the way in this morning, I have a wonderful coincidental meeting with Angel Jones, the CEO of the Homecoming Revolution, which is I don't think this is an advert, this is a headhunter for Africans, bringing Africans home. And her observation is that what you see on Carte Blanche on Sunday night, which was about people leaving, perhaps is not quite the statistical reality. And that in their work, which is up to date, not based on 2003 data, but rather based on 2018 data, 2019 data, I told you not to correct me while I was... 2019 data, sorry, did I say 18? Tells the Homecoming Revolution that 1 in 2 is looking to return. That is West African, East African, and South African data. There is cause for enthusiasm in Africa, and South Africa is part of that cause. I hope you have a fantastic morning with us. Thank you for being here. Andile.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
The part that Adrian didn't say is that the other connection is that he taught both myself and Pili economics at university. So if you thought he was young, he's a very old man. Before we kick off, ladies and gentlemen, I thought it might be useful for us to all get a context of what Africa Day is all about. Good morning to you and welcome to the Africa Day celebrations hosted by the Center for African Management and Markets here at Gibbs. My name is Andile Khumalo. I'll be your host for the day, and also I'm a proud fellow of CAM. Now I'm going to read you a very short and summarized history of Africa Day because I do think it contextualizes the conversation we're going to have later on. After World War II, the process of decolonization of the African continent gathered momentum as Africans increasingly agitated for political rights and independence. While in some parts of the continent, colonial partners, or colonial powers rather, reluctantly and grudgingly relinquished power, in other parts, African people launched protracted struggles against the recalcitrant colonial regimes. Thus, between 1945 and 1965, a significant number of African countries gained independence from European colonial powers. Ghana became the first African country south of the Sahara to gain independence on the 6th of March, 1957. Just over a year after its independence, Ghana, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, convened the first conference of independent African states on the 15th of April, 1958. It is worth noting that there were only 8 African countries who were independent at the time. The conference was an unequivocal assertion of Africa's rejection of colonial and imperialist domination of the continent. And that is where the idea of observing African Freedom or African Liberation Day was born. It was to be observed annually to further encourage and forge a common goal of fighting against colonial rule. Between 1959 and 1963, more African countries became independent, and the need for an organization that would articulate the aspirations of African people and their struggle arose. That is why on the 25th of May, 1963, leaders of now 32 African countries converged in Ethiopia's capital of Addis Ababa and formed the Organization of African Unity, which is the OAU. Amongst other things that were discussed at that particular conference was the fact that the date of African Freedom Day will then be moved from the 15th of April, having been that first conference organized by the Ghana leader at the time, to the 25th of May. This year, of course, we are now celebrating essentially 61 years of a free African continent. However, with freedom, as we all know, comes responsibility. And we as a generation here are tasked with a different responsibility to our forefathers. They were tasked, of course, with the political freedom responsibility, which I guess to a large extent, you must admit, they achieved that with some aplomb, with our own country, South Africa, being the very last to gain that independence. We have a new kind of responsibility as leaders today, wherever you are from, and ours is undoubtedly towards economic prosperity for all Africans. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma once spoke of a rich Africa and poor Africans. And I guess our responsibility is to ensure that that rich Africa leads to a much more economically prosperous African. Without any further ado, that's the reason we are all here. And I'm very honored to introduce you to the panel that will discuss the theme. Before I do so, let me tell you how we're going to run this morning. I, for one, do not want to assume that the people that are going to be seated here are the only experts in the room. I'm pretty sure you are here because you yourself have your own experience in doing business on the continent, and perhaps a mixture of challenges and some successes that you yourself would like to share. So when we say we are opening for the Q&A, it doesn't assume that you only have questions. I assume you also have answers. So if you have some comments to make, please feel free to make those comments as well and make your contribution to the conversation. And through the conversation, I'm going to be taking some pauses to let you guys in so that you can contribute as well. Let me then introduce you to our panel. First up is my schoolmate. She's the founding chair of CEO of Shanghai Group, and that's a business she's recently started. This is after spending about 20 years in various management positions here in South Africa, as CFO of MTN South Africa for many years, and then later on as Chief Executive Officer of MTN Cameroon. She was the first female appointed to such a position in the telco group. She is currently the non-exec director at JSE-listed AECI, and she has many, many accolades, but I will tell you about a few. She is the Africa Report, you know, the big magazine. She's the Africa Report's top 50 star deal makers of 2017, and the Global Telecoms Business top 50 women to watch for, or to look out for rather, in 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Philisiwe Sibiya. Thank you, Pili. Why don't you grab the one over there? Thank you. And then right next to her is the current CEO of Sanlam Emerging Markets. He was appointed in the role in 2016. In fact, at the time of his appointment, he went and spent lots of billions of rands from Stellenbosch, and he decided to take them to Morocco. And he bought a very big business there, which is going to be a big part of our conversation, that he has invested in. He took a small stake, then another small stake, and recently he's now taken an even bigger stake. I think you're now the only shareholder of the business. Yes, indeed. Please, guys, put your hands together for Mr. Junior Ngulube. Junior, if you don't mind sitting over here for me. And then the academic amongst us, although I think he's got aspirations of being an entrepreneur from the short conversations I've had with him. We'll see about that. I'm talking about Professor Tawana Kupe. He took the reins as VC and principal of the University of Pretoria just last year, November, joining from the Wits Faculty of Humanities, where he was executive dean. He has studied English at UZ, right? Is that the right thing? I was being taught earlier on that University of Zimbabwe is UZ. But when they went to the University of Zimbabwe, it was University of Rhodesia. So they're not young either, just in case you thought they were young. So Prof. Kupe earned his doctorate in philosophy and media studies at the University of Oslo in Norway. And his arrival, of course, at UP coincides with something very interesting and quite relevant to our conversation today. And that is the Future Africa Research Institute, which is a purpose-built campus to promote a transdisciplinary research that places science, technology, and innovation at the center of Africa's development. Please put your hands together for Professor Kupe. Over there, Prof. Thank you very much, guys, for making the time. I truly appreciate it. I guess a good place to start is your own reflections on the theme of staying positive, or of having reason to be enthusiastic, because we've got many reasons to be depressed. We typically share perhaps more time at dinner tables talking about the negative stories. I'm interested in your own views, particularly through your own experience of both those worlds, where you've kind of experienced some of the difficulties of doing business on the continent as Africans yourselves, but also, and perhaps with more focus, on the reason why we should all be a lot more positive. What's been your experience, Junior?
Well, thank you, firstly, for the invitation. I've been doing business on the continent since 1987.
1987?
Yes, so I've been traveling the continent for over 30 years.
Right.
And if you think it's difficult now, I should have tried it then. So I've seen the continent change and change for the better.
Right.
I've seen the ways of doing business, the possibilities of doing business improve tremendously over the years. I've also seen the level of, I think, confidence by African businesses in doing business in Africa. I think if you look today, there are a lot of African businesses, whether it's in banking, manufacturing, telecoms, homegrown, some call them lions, that have been very successful and continue to be successful. For me, if we as Africans are not going to invest in our own continent, we cannot expect others to come and invest. So that's my source of enthusiasm, my source of courage to carry on.
Right.
But also, because I've been on the ground, I've seen the changes, I've seen the positive changes. Yes, we read the economics books, yes, we follow and listen to the professors, but it's different to when you see a city change in front of your very eyes.
Give me an example.
I first went to Luanda, to give an example. I think it was the year 2000.
Luanda, Angola.
Luanda, Angola. There was one hotel, the president, which used to cost $450. And I use the term hotel rather loosely.
Touché.
And I was back, I've been going there almost every year since then. I was there 2 weeks ago, my most recent visit. If you walk around what they call the marginal, the seafront, you see the skyscrapers. You go to Talatona, Luanda Sul, a brand new city that was constructed since then.
Yeah.
The new vehicles in the streets. You cannot help but be positive and be excited for this country. I can repeat this for almost every other capital city that I've visited over the years.
Right.
Yeah.
And that gives you the confidence and enthusiasm.
Absolute confidence.
Okay, let me move on to you, Phili. You've worked here in South Africa, but you've had the opportunity to work every day, not visit, like some of us, in and out, fly in, stay at the hotel, go to meetings, and then say, I've been to Nigeria. You lived there. You worked out in Cameroon specifically, but you've, I'm sure, has had the opportunity to travel other countries. What's your reason for being enthusiastic?
There is a lot. I didn't start doing business in Africa in 1987. But
of course, you were like 7 years old in 1987.
I started in 2002, actually, and one of the first countries I went to was Rwanda.
Right.
And if there is an example of a country within the continent that really gives hope in terms of what is possible within the continent, we can debate the politics, but today let's focus on the result. It is probably Rwanda. Country that is completely unrecognizable today. I remember when I went, this was the beginning of MTN Rwanda at the time, there was hardly anything in Rwanda at the time. I remember being invited to go to, at the time, the famous church where the massacre happened, and that's all really there was in Rwanda. I went to Rwanda 18 months ago, and I was astounded. I've had the privilege being part of MTN, and all of us that have ever worked at MTN, I think, have got war stories that we love to compare when we meet, because we, whether it was Nigeria, whether it was Uganda, whether it was the, Francophone Africa, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, we've all seen the evolution. We have got a continent that has got 60% of youth that is under 25 years old. And the arrival of the internet has changed the continent completely. I arrived in Cameroon, I remember very well, as CEO at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, and there was hardly any internet that was functioning. To download anything, you literally had the old days, leave it running for a couple of minutes and you come back. You go to Cameroon today, they have got probably the fastest internet in the Semak region in Central Africa. You look at the infrastructure, go to Ethiopia, and all you see is just crane after crane after crane. You're looking at a new city being born from scratch. And I think everybody has got the Lagos stories. Those of us that went to Lagos in the early 2000s, there are stories and stories to be told about watching literally Lagos resurrect itself from scratch. Exactly like Junior, going to Lagos in the early 2000s was more of a survivor game. In terms of which hotel, it was more of, well, just be grateful you've got a roof over your head and some water that's coming out of the tap. So in terms of the optimism, there is a lot to go on. The East Africa region, for me, is a region that I look at, whether you're starting as far down as Mozambique all the way to Ethiopia. A heck of a lot happening. Be it Kenya, be it Rwanda, be it Ethiopia, a region that is really growing leaps and bounds. Connectivity is improving the continent quite a lot. There's, airline hubs back to back in East Africa, about 4 now, that have really uplifted that region in terms of growth.
But many people then will quickly say, well, but Billy, it's hard to do business on the continent. It's really difficult. You've run a South African company operating in Cameroon. How hard is it?
It's very hard. I think, there is a little bit of naivety on our side as South Africans when we approach the continent. The continent looks at us as arrogant. And it's a constant when you interact in the continent, that on our side there is huge amount of hubris, I think, in terms of we look at the continent and we think, oh, let's just replicate what has worked in South Africa and therefore it shall work. We don't look at the continent as 54 unique jurisdictions with unique laws, with unique history. And I think for that, we've paid some school fees as a country, but it doesn't take away from the fact that if you're looking at a market that remains in the whole world, that still remains vastly untapped, it is the African continent. What does it take to do business in Africa? A lot. It takes an understanding that it is not South Africa. It takes a little bit of homework in understanding the laws. And normally it's not what is written in the law, but it's there. It is everything that happens after the law that has been written down, because, and that is, we as South Africa will do a due diligence and, oh yeah, the laws are there, and the judiciary is there, and it's like, and I'm always like, okay, where do you want me to start in terms of what can possibly go wrong in the interpretation? But in terms of the degree of difficulty, we cannot take that away. And like I said, we are not a single country. We are 54 different countries. The return that are in the continent are still very, very high in terms of doing business. But in terms of what it takes to run a business successfully, I think, go ask Woolworths, go ask Tiger, go ask MTN, it is not as easy as it is portrayed, without painting it as a negative story.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, Prof, I'm tempted to ask you the academic question, but no, I'm not going to ask you the academic question. I'm going to ask you the practical question. What's been your experience?
So, okay, well, perhaps I should update my CV a little from what you said. When I left WITS, because it's relevant to what I'm going to say. When I left WITS, I was the equivalent to a chief operating officer in the private sector. But just generally, the way I've conducted my academic career, I've been an academic since I was 25, because I finished my master's. I've only changed universities and not worked outside the sector. But the one thing I've done also because of my interest is to see the economic development of the continent. So I'm very happy that both Pili and Junior made the point I wanted to start off with, is that if you're going to discuss enthusiasm and Africa's development, you have to take a long-term view of the economic history of the continent. And that is absolutely vitally important. So I was very glad that you started at 1987. Because if you just add 2 years to 1989 and go and take a snapshot of business in Africa in 1989 and 2019, it's a massive sea change, despite the contradictions, despite all of the corruption, the regulatory problems, the protectionism, the xenophobia, not only where people think South Africans are arrogant. Many Africans are also arrogant, by the way, when you try to do business in that area. But what is very interesting is, if you went back to 1989, people, let me remind you what the continent was like. There were only 3 countries that had democratic elections. It was Mauritius, Botswana, and Senegal. The rest, South Africa, you know what the story was. Well, you can, in 89, well, you could add Zimbabwe in there, because Zimbabwe was never really a one-party state. But most countries were one-party states or military dictatorships, right? But that was replicated in the economic arena. There was one telecoms company owned by the state, run by a real apparatchik from the military junta or the one-party state. All the way to Kenya, by the way. People forget Kenya was a one-party state until the 1990s. You could go through any sectors of the economy. They were state-controlled, not even state-run, state-run down, because they were in a terrible shape. They were totally in a terrible state, where if you looked at, for example, if you take telecoms, where the telephone lines, the landlines installed during the colonial regimes had not increased or had even decreased. But the telecoms company had so many employees from the ruling party. Now, wind back to 2019. Most countries on the continent are multi-party states. Yeah, some of the ruling parties are still corrupt, but many countries are multi-party states. There's been significant privatization of the private sector. The state is still a player, but not the only player. With telecoms, and that is why people like Philisiwe are successful, when the new technologies came in, the state could not compete because they had not developed those. So the private sector came in, your MTNs, your Vodacoms, and all of those came in. So I think that we must, if you take a long view of the continent, it's developing in the right direction. But I think here one has to inject, sorry, you said I shouldn't be an academic, I'm going to be. One of the things I've studied along the way is development economics or development theory. And this applies to anywhere in the world. There is no linear development in economic development. There's no nation that has developed in a linear fashion, whether it's China or even the United States, which, by the way, was once a colony of the United Kingdom. The United States is a very interesting country because it's a colony that became, in some ways, successful economically and now dominates others. But there is no linear history, right? So that is one point. Now, from the positions I've occupied in academia, especially my last position at Wits, I did 2 things that taught me a lot about the continent. I decided cheekily to create an African Center for the study of the United States as a nation and as a society. And it was interesting to then interact across the continent with both Africans and across America with the corporate sector, universities, civil society, civil rights movements, and others, to see what people's view of Africa is. Last week, I was traveling in the United States. I ended up at MIT before I had to run back because of my duties. The one thing I've heard in all of the 5 years I've been traveling around the continent and in the United States and to a lesser extent in Europe, everybody kept on saying to me, you can't afford not to be in Africa. So I often thought it was just because I'm an African, they want to make me feel good. But then I heard it so consistently, I started also asking questions. What do you mean? People say the things that we roll off our tongues, matter of fashion. The youth dividend, the population growth.
Yep.
Andile mentioned the rate of economic growth. People say despite all of those problems, if you are not in Africa, you are actually out of the future. So the second statement people make is, the future is Africa. And that is why at the University of Pretoria, we created this Future Africa Institute and campus. But the way, just to get an imagination, it's a campus, it's actually a physical campus, slightly bigger than this. It is also a hotel, like, not a hotel, a 300-bed facility like the hotel we have here. Big auditoriums like this. As I speak right now, there is a team of Japanese businesses, academics, and the embassy and South African academics that have been discussing for the last 2 days. The Japanese, when I opened the conference the other night, the Japanese said, we're very grateful you accepted us here. We can't afford not to be here.
Wow.
We're going to be left behind. And this is being discussed. This is an academic conference, by the way. But the top Japanese businesses, JICA, the Japanese Development Agency, is there. So I think that you got to take that view as well, is that it's not only us that are saying that there is a future in the continent. Enthusiasm does not mean that therefore there isn't any obstacles, any problems. There is no history where there hasn't been any obstacles. Talk to the Chinese during the Cultural Revolution. They never thought it could be what it is today.
Yeah.
Today they have new problems. Hawaii is in trouble because of, I'm not going to get into that. But during the Cultural Revolution, China was going backwards, actually. Yeah. So then, if I might say, in Morocco, I've also been to Morocco. I went to Morocco last year. I found, colonialists used to say they discovered things in Africa, which is very interesting. I discovered something in Morocco when I went there last year. I went for an academic conference on the rankings of the universities. But I was looking for partners for my Center for the Study of the United States as a nation and as a society. By the way, just one or two lines on that. The reason why I created that center was that I wanted that as Africans to move away from a dichotomous view of the world. Perhaps not people in this room, but people especially in the ruling party, in the ANC, and much older people still have a Cold War mentality. They think about the socialists and the capitalists, and there's a lot in between, right? And if you study the United States, you'll be debunked that the United States is simply a capitalist country, and that necessarily is an example of everything. Yeah. It's an example of certain things and not others. And so I now needed partners because this center had to be truly African, not just WITS, but other universities. So then looking in the internet, I found that there was a university called the International University of Rabat in Morocco. Nobody had ever heard of it. So I decided, I wrote them letters, they didn't respond, as often happens on the continent. I decided just to rock up in a taxi from my hotel. So when I told them who I was, they said, of course. So I went everywhere to see even my equivalent. Oh, it's like the vice chancellor of the university. Can I tell you something about this university? One, it was started in 2010. It has a business school as good as this one. And do you know who created the university? Academics who were living in Europe, all across, top Moroccan academics who were living across Morocco, the US and Europe. They decided to come back, got land from the government, and created a brand new university in 2010. It is a business school where 90% of the academics in the business school have PhDs, have done research, have worked in companies. So they combine both practical knowledge, research knowledge, which is something that we still have to reach ourselves, right? And then in this university, students pay fees, but they use the American model. They say to you, okay, you've been admitted, how much can you pay? Pay your fee, we'll pay the rest, and they do fundraising. So the government only gave them land. All of the buildings are eco-friendly, they use solar systems. If you give me your numbers, I'll WhatsApp you my pictures standing around all of them. Absolutely fascinating. But this is an interesting story, right? So people had left the continent because of the dark days before 1989. With fantastic academic careers in Europe, come back, ask the government not for everything, but just for land, mobilize resources. So the business school in Morocco now, every city in Morocco now, you'll hear it when you go there, wants that business school to create a campus in their city. They're producing, they're doing some of the finest business education as we do at, by the way, as we do at Gibbs. You know that, right? Yeah. You should all register here. But this is a fascinating story.
It is.
Also, you couldn't do that if there wasn't a market and an economy that is growing, that needs managers, executives to be educated. So what we need to do then is, what I'm going to ask the dean here to do is, I want a partnership with that business school in Morocco.
I see.
Because those are the African partnerships.
Okay, let's stay with Morocco though, Prof. Thanks for that. Let's stay with Morocco, Junior. $1.7 billion. You went to go and buy a business there. In fact, you were new in the job, so hopefully you made the money back for poor Sanlam. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Why?
I think maybe one should position this thing from the beginning.
Yeah.
I like the way you started the session talking about the African Union. I would like to take it back even earlier and talk about Pan-Africanism, because that's, I think, the important story. The African Union was an epoch in this Pan-African journey. It starts during the slavery times. I think William Du Bois is the one credited with creating the term Pan-Africanism. And at that time, it was the slaves yearning to go back to Africa. And that was their preoccupation, and that's what led to the creation of this movement. And then in 1900, in the UK, was the first Pan-African conference to discuss this whole idea of Pan-Africanism. Then it morphed and became a movement focusing on the independence and liberation of Africa from 1900, leading to the independence of Ghana that you spoke about. And when Ghana got independent, it was the first African country to get independent. It declared that under Kwame Nkrumah, Africa or Ghana will not be free until the rest of the continent is free. So still under the umbrella of Pan-Africanism, the focus then changes to that of independence. And then the creation of the Organization of African Union in 1963. It then morphs once more under the era of the Thabo Mbeki's, Bouteflika, Obasanjo of Nigeria. After the creation of the African Union, it now starts to focus on the economics of the continent. And the African Union was modeled along the European Union principles. This is when we start getting the NEPADs, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, the African Peer Review Mechanism. We're now talking governance of the continent. The Pan-African Parliament, which sits in Midrand. That is another epoch in terms of how this Pan-African movement develops. And then it moves on. We now start talking about African integration. If you remember, under NEPAD, there were a number of initiatives in terms of integrating infrastructure.
Yeah.
The North-South corridor.
Yeah.
Opening the African skies. Intra-Africa trade. And then more recently, the African Intercontinental Free Trade Agreement. You can see different epochs of this Pan-African movement.
Over time.
Over time. At the beginning of the year, Sanlam were now in 33 countries on the continent. We changed the name of our business on the continent outside of South Africa. We are now called Sanlam Pan-Africa. It's a bold claim.
Sanlam Pan-Africa.
Pan-Africa.
I suspect you had something to do with that. I can't see the Stellenbosch guys sitting around the table going, yeah, we're going to call it Sanlam Pan-Africa. No.
I learned
I think that's you.
You'll be surprised.
you know? So I give you this background to position or to explain how, as Sanlam, we see the future of the continent and our future in it. With that move, I can assure you Sanlam long ceased to be a South African business.
Right.
It is a Pan-African business.
Right.
And this started actually in 2005, the expansion onto the continent, even before we started discussing with Saham.
With Saham, yeah, in Morocco.
Yes. But also interestingly, in 2005, Saham itself started expanding from the north via acquisitions. And when we had the conversations with them, the first conversations were in 2014. And we acquired a 30% stake in 2016. They were in 26 countries already, including the Middle East. In Africa, they were in 19 countries. We were also in 19 countries. So you had these two organizations on a Pan-African journey. We met somewhere in the middle. And then in 2017, we acquired another 16.6%. And what then probably made the news was when we acquired the balance last year, the 53%.
That's the $1 billion.
That's $1 billion. That's a lot of money.
Indeed, and I'm interested in the consumer story in that, because this whole enthusiasm conversation goes macroeconomics, which I think we've discussed. You've shared your story over the years, watching cities go up.
Yes.
Pili's also weighed in and has the Prof. At a consumer level, back to Nkosazana Dlamini's quote about a rich Africa and poor Africans. When you're in insurance business and you're paying $1.7 billion to buy this business that's, I guess, headquartered in Morocco, but not only in Morocco, you clearly have to take a view on the consumers.
Now, then what does this footprint in 33 countries give us? Firstly, I have to explain our business model. It is based on partnerships. We have partners, and I mean local partners, in every country that we operate in, who are shareholders in those companies. In some instances, there's 1 or 2, 3 places where we still don't have partners, and we are busy looking for them. Why? Firstly, it's a win-win business model.
To have a local partner.
Definitely. Secondly, as Sanlam, last year we turned 100 years old. We know one thing or two about running an insurance business. But we will be the first to admit we know very little about doing that in every country on the continent. That's where the local partners come.
I see.
They give us that guidance. They know the terrain. They are invested in the business. And we only have local CEOs in our businesses.
Only local CEOs.
Only local CEOs.
You don't fly in the South Africans.
Out of the 33 countries, I think it's only in Botswana where we recently sent a colleague from South Africa. Everywhere else, it's non-South Africans. The boards are local people. We are represented on the boards, but they run the businesses. And then I have a team. It's 98 people in South Africa, almost half and half between here and Cape Town. Another 75 in Morocco. Now you're talking your actuaries, your accounting people, your IT people, who provide support to the businesses, not to run the businesses. If one of our partners want to change their IT system, I've got a team of guys who do this for a living. And they go and support the guys to roll out a new application. That is the business model.
I see.
But then what does it give Sanlam? Our vision is to be the leading Pan-African financial services group. We want to be number 1, 2, or 3 in every market that we operate. We occupy this in a number of countries, not all of them. If you are not number 1, 2, or 3 in many markets, you're actually only hiding to nothing. You lack scale. So we want that. We also want to be the insurer or provider of choice for the local market. Now you're talking retail in the main. Secondly, because we're in 33 countries, we have, I call it an ecosystem that cuts across the whole continent.
Yeah.
So if you're a multinational MTN and you are in 20 countries and you need insurance for your company or your employees in 20 countries, who are you going to talk to? You can talk to 23 different companies in 23 countries, or you talk to Sanlam and you get sorted once.
You know I'm sending you an invoice for that, right?
Absolutely an advert.
No, this is whose platform is it?
So then what you have is businesses that support the local market,
Yeah.
businesses that then provide an ecosystem for investors who are coming onto the continent.
I see.
And when we talk multinationals, it's African multinationals, internationals. We would like to be their preferred service provider. But it gets even more interesting. And this, I have to be honest, was not part of our strategy. It's just one of those, like when you're hunting an elephant, just walks across the road.
Oh, I see.
You know,
It came at you.
it came at us. So we're busy minding our own business, and one international insurer approaches us, actually a Japanese insurance company, Sompo to be precise, it's public knowledge. And they say to us, look, we've got a lot of Japanese multinationals doing business throughout the continent. We don't have Sompo in anywhere in Africa. Neither do we intend to have Sompo in Africa. Can we work together?
To which you said?
Of course. So now we are supporting Sompo to make sure that their Japanese clients get their insurance needs for themselves,
I see.
for their employees. We are in discussions with one of the largest Chinese companies as we speak, insurance company, along similar lines. And there are a number of other distribution partners. We do a lot with telcos in terms of distribution.
I see.
We do bank assurance with a whole number of banks across the continent
I see.
because of this
Scale.
scale and this ecosystem.
Makes a lot
So
of sense.
it gives us,
Yeah.
and this is why, for us, it was worth spending the money. But it is complex. It's a very complex business.
I can only imagine. Pili, I'm
And
interested.
maybe if I just
Yeah.
finish there.
Okay.
Because we're not only an insurance company.
Yes. One more advert.
One
okay.
more ad.
Okay.
So we do life insurance across the continent, short-term insurance. We do asset management. We do retail credit. We do health. We do assistance, roadside assistance. And we do reinsurance. We own 2 reinsurance companies. So it's 7.
And you do this in all 33 markets?
We don't have all the products in all the countries, but certainly the core products are in every country.
Are you done? Can I send the invoice? Thank you so much, Junior, for that. Pili, Junior's mentioning a few tenets of success and why their model has worked for them. And it makes a lot of sense, I guess. I'm sure the audience feels the same. I guess when you hear it, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm kind of having the feeling of, why didn't everybody do it the way you just said, right? But it's easy for me to say because you just told us. Yes. What in your experience are other keys to success on trading on the continent, doing business on the continent, in your experience being on the ground? What are some of the things you'd leave us as tips to take with us in our ammunition bag?
I think the localization is always one of the big debates when you go into the continent. And it's one of those that you have to tread very carefully in terms of that the brand, the arrogant South Africans, goes very much hand in hand with how we treat localization. Most of the time when we move into the continent, we normally cut, paste management teams from here out into the continent. And we normally keep that going for many, many years. And what that normally does, it creates a 2-tier structure where you almost have got the locals versus the expats. Now,
in the business,
within the business itself. And it breeds all sorts in terms of what then happens, because you need the staff that are carrying the business locally to have vested interest in making the business successful. But if they are not seeing themselves as part of that business, that becomes very hard. At the same time, the skill gap sometimes might appear. The good thing with the continent is these vast expatriates that come from the continent, exactly like Professor was saying, that are all over the world, that can be tapped into. So in terms of, number one, making sure that localization and how it is very delicate, because you can localize too early and then you crash and burn, or you can leave it too late and by then the trust deficit has set in and it's too big to bridge. So so in terms of making sure that you really understand that dynamic of making sure that you do not create that two-tier structure.
That's
is really, really critical. Secondly, I think is the whole issue around understanding when do you need partners when you go into the continent. When do you go in as a South African business, 100% owned, I'm just going to set up a subsidiary here and I'm going to be successful.
Yeah.
But it's not whether you need partners or not. It's who do you partner with. I think the answer of do you need partners or not is very obvious. Of course you do. But where it's very, very easy, and I've seen this become a huge impediment, is when you walk into a country and you get given partners without conducting the necessary due diligence.
Who gives you the partners?
The politicians, the minister, the most powerful man in the country, the one who's got proximity to the president. It depends how you enter the country. So how you enter the country will set the road and a tone of how you exit the country or stay in that country. And it really is true.
Right.
So in terms of blindly packing up your suitcases and I'm going to Nigeria and I'm going to set up business, the entry route into that country and so the partnership model that we develop as South Africans, I think can be very naive sometimes because in a lot of these countries, there's still quite a lot of evolution that is happening. So I was based in Cameroon. Who's the president of Cameroon? It is the Honorable Mr. Paul Biya, who's been there for 35 years. He probably will not be there I'm not saying anything about his health, but in the next 5 years. Now you walk into a country, Cameroon, and you get given a partner. 5 years, the Honorable Paul Biya is replaced by Honorable XYZ, who's now looking at you with your partners and is saying, I was not part of that. So the entry into these partnerships and how you can find yourself into a twirl of politics and you just can't get unstuck from that is seriously dangerous. So the partnership model, exactly as Junior was saying in terms of having partners, it is suicidal to be in the continent without partners. As South Africans, we do not know the continent. Most of us have only been out to the continent post-2000 even. So in terms of what we think we understand about the continent is very superficial. And in terms of then how we enter and we stay or exit these countries is very much the Tiger Brands Dangote Mill story I still find fascinating.
Right.
Because it is one of those stories where I'm like, I wonder who put this deal together because there's a whole thesis there. Because there is a story of how you exit and how you enter is very correlated. So the partnership model for me is absolutely critical. It's not rocket science whether you need partners, but who and how you partner with could be a suicide mission. And obviously making sure that the danger model that I've seen is that separation of where you do not get enough of a buy-in, and you are now starting to see a lot of countries in the continent forcing listings in South African subsidiaries. So you're seeing all of a sudden these, almost everybody has got their own little stock exchange. I think Angola was the last country to have a stock exchange. Most of these stock exchanges are not sustainable, they're too small. But the businesses that are coming out into the continent, especially where you do find success, you start getting yourself into a situation where therefore you must list. And one of the hedges that we do not take into where the government see the success, but that success is not seen as shared with the country, eventually you will run into that wall where, okay, then we will make you share. We will make you, the dividend can't just be one direction, only Mauritius via to South Africa. There has to be something that stays in country, therefore we will force you to list. So the whole local partnership and how you build to stay and build to be seen to be part of the community within the continent,
Okay.
I think is one way we miscalculate a lot.
Okay. Hashtag MTN Nigeria.
Didn't say anything. Absolutely. I would never say such a thing.
Before I go to in a minute, I'm going to come to you guys, so please prepare your comments and questions. Let me ask the Prof to weigh in one more time.
It's very fascinating what they just said. And so you may use an academic term and then get out of the academic jargon. It's something we call the political economy.
Yeah.
So what these guys are talking about, the political economy of doing business on the continent, the dynamics of the politics and the economics. And just not to criticize this, but the story about the AU, we're leaving out something. One of the things that the OAU never fully addressed was, okay, Africa gets independence.
Yeah.
What economic policies will it pursue?
Exactly.
And how will it develop the continent economically?
Sure.
So in fact, Nkrumah is quoted as having said, seek ye the political kingdom first. And I think fundamentally that might have been...
So he
one
was
of the-
Christian.
Yeah, well, they're sort of,
Yeah.
but he might have fundamentally made a mistake there.
Of
that
course.
First you gain political independence,
Then what?
and then you then pursue economic freedom. The two things were intertwined. Colonialism was not about just racism. The racism was a cover for a bigger economic project. And so by not intertwining those two and developing a macroeconomic framework for the continent early on, we're seeing the consequences
Absolutely.
now.
Absolutely.
So NEPAD was trying to do that. So you have your SADC, your ECOWAS, your East Africa. So the things you are talking about, yes, companies have to do it themselves. But heavy lifting is needed by the politicians to create an environment across the continent where there is greater ease of doing business. That does not absolve the business people from finding the right, as Philly said, finding the right partners. But to avoid predatory activities like the politicians giving you a partner should be the economic project of the AU now. The AU must understand now that we have the political freedom.
Yeah.
And those political freedoms must be protected through free and fair elections, accountability mechanisms, transparency, dealing with corruption.
Yeah.
But then also create a business framework. As
Yeah.
you know, they have the blueprints, but they are in the shelves. They are in the inbox, but they're actually not been opened. SADC was supposed to have had a currency by now and an economic zone. Only recently did they create the All Africa Trade Zone. All of those things are needed. Because remember that the 54 countries we talk about are a colonial creation. They're not actually an African creation. And they do not make sense. Apologies for picking on Lesotho. Does it make sense to have Lesotho economic?
I'm not going to say anything.
But even, let me go for it. Does it make sense to have Zimbabwe economically post-94? Or Botswana? Or does it make sense also to just have South Africa without the others? It doesn't make sense because if you look at the top companies, Old Mutual is a great example. There's a story unfolding on Old Mutual of a person we all know. Old Mutual is big here and also is big in Zimbabwe and the rest of Southern Africa. They actually treat it as one company. Your Pan-African business has created an African country through economic means when there are political barriers.
Yeah.
But at some point you might get grief. And one last plug about Morocco. Morocco is actually, we've all quoted Morocco positively. There is a problem. Morocco is a country that previously treated itself as part of the North, if you like, the Arab North, or even the Middle East. But if you go to Morocco now, and I spent a lot of time with some politicians and business people, they say we're an African country now. If you go to West Africa, big investments, road building in Cameroon, Senegal, in Ivory Coast is being done by the Moroccan. And Morocco itself is like upgrading skyscrapers. They're trying to build the biggest tower in Africa and all of that. So, but there's interesting geopolitics there because Morocco is a big problem in the Sahrawi part of the country where things that should not happen are still happening because there are very big mineral deposits there. And so I think that in discussing our enthusiasm about Africa, let's put all of the complex factors on the table.
Absolutely.
And then say what institutions are going to deal with this and what will business schools like this, universities like the University of Pretoria will do and what he will do with these emerging markets. That's a plug for my university. People must come and study here because you get to understand all of this.
Absolutely. Wow. A round of applause for our panel, eh? Really. feels like an MBA class on its own, doesn't it? I'm learning about business models, partnerships, stakeholders, and institutions that need to do the right thing. Right now, it's your turn, ladies and gentlemen. Please get the microphones ready. If you don't mind, just state who you are and where you're from. I'm particularly interested in what you do in your daytime. I'm not interested in your nocturnal activities. And then any comment or question you might have. Let me start with the gentleman here.
Good morning to everyone. You know, most of us don't realize when we are amongst greatness. And today I feel extremely privileged to be a part of this discussion. My name is Zonke Mahlangu. I'm the founder and CEO of Mazo Group. Through my company, I took about 14 South Africans, 4 Namibians, and 1 Zimbabweans to Rwanda. We were there from the 13th of April until 13th of May until the 20th of May. So the whole idea was to partner and collaborate with entrepreneurs from Rwanda. And when we got there, we were blown away. One of the ministers was telling me that in 1994, they had dead bodies everywhere. So they had to start from scratch and build themselves up, you know, and the way that politically they are sound, you know, the laws protect your business and the ease of doing business. You know, you can open your business in less than 6 hours, whereas in South Africa, 2 weeks, unless you can bribe somebody. But my point is to say that, guys, Africa is open for business. So I think for us as South Africans, we have a bit of resources. Let's go into the country, into these different countries. So we are going to Ghana in September. October, we're doing Tanzania as a Mazo Group. So for any of you guys that would like to join us, you can just visit mazogroup.com. Sorry for stealing your platform.
Oh, well done. Well done.
Thank you.
That's exactly how it should be done.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Manqoba Zungu. And it's funny that you mentioned Rwanda, my brother. So I run a mentorship program. We created a mentorship program that takes unemployed graduates, skills them up, and places them into employment to assist them to start their own businesses. And that program was founded out of the Gibbs MBA. Now, Dr. Seville was my lecturer for economics, and we spent a lot of time on Rwanda. And that led me to have an interest in going to Kigali for my elective. But you find that that elective or that trip was then scratched out because of a lack of interest. Everyone wanted to go to the East, to America, to Europe. I ended up going to Singapore and Vietnam. Now, my question is to the panel, everyone, you know, Ubab Jr. has mentioned the Sompo partnership, Usotobe spoke about Woolies, Tiger Brands, etc. The Prof spoke about the Moroccan partnership and the youth dividend that we speak about. Is this not a time for us to then be deliberate, Prof? I know you've mentioned the Moroccan Business School, but for us to be deliberate about the partnerships that we have, even with businesses on the continent, so that the MBAs or the other sort of courses here at Gibbs or anywhere else at other institutions almost don't have a choice about this is what I'll choose, this is what I'll choose. It's part of the curriculum because in my program I've got students from Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Zambia, and the richness and the diversity is just exceptional. So is this not a point for us to then start being deliberate about the partnerships that we have to start getting South Africans onto the continent? As Usotobe said, we think we know the continent, but we don't.
Good question. Yeah. Prof and Pili?
Yeah, so I think you're quite right about the last one. So what we're doing at the University of Pretoria, so in next week I'll send off a group of medical students across the continent as part of, you know, when you're a medical student, you have to do some internships and some electives. So instead of them doing them in South Africa only, they'll go all the way to Tanzania, going to rural clinics and primary health care clinics. But one of the things I'm traveling around the world trying to do is to build a staff and student mobility fund, where almost like you say, take of a better word on a Friday morning, compulsorily, when you are a student at UP, you need to actually have an experience beyond the borders of South Africa. It might even be going to take a semester's course at the University of Lagos or a semester's course at the University of Nairobi. When you complete that degree and I keep your head, you actually have had that experience. Because that will create, that is what, with respect, Americans do and Europeans do. Yeah. You come to my campus now, the other side. This afternoon, I'm meeting a lot of students from Fordham University in the US. They will be with us for the rest of the semester. Fortunately, we're sending some UP students at Fordham. I was with them last week. But we need to do that on a larger scale, but across the continent and not just in Europe. Absolutely. And North America.
The 3 years I lived in Cameroon were probably the best 3 years of my career. And one of the things I've consistently said, before I went to Cameroon, I was on the brink of going to Harvard. And I was having very robust discussions with HR at the time to say, you know, do I go as CEO or do I go to Harvard? And eventually I chose to go as CEO. It was probably the best decision of my life. And if anybody around the room has got an opportunity to work and live in the continent, it will change your life. I can't encourage enough for companies to send staff on a permanent basis. Spending 7 days in the continent is great. Yeah. Even spending 6 months is great. But spending 2 years, 3 years will transform. Initially, when I went to Cameroon, I was very unsure. First of all, it's a French-speaking country. At the time, I didn't speak French. To be honest, I wasn't even sure in terms of fitting, how I was going to fit in the environment, and had to learn about that country. But after the 3 years, having been there and having been based there, it transforms, especially as South Africans who have been closed up for so long. Yeah. If you do have the chance, I really cannot encourage enough in terms of what it does. The 3 years I spent there probably were worth 3 MBAs from Harvard. Wow. In terms of, you know, I always say to people, every 6 months I was graduating from another Ivy League. It was just, and I wouldn't exchange it for anything. Absolutely. I really wouldn't. So in terms of the opportunity and what it does in transforming, especially the South Africans, but also in terms of just broadening your mind, it is an exceptional opportunity. And having a chance to go to the US or the continent, please go to the continent.
There we go.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes. I'm going to call you with Mr. $1.7 billion from now. Sir?
Yes, I think Philly sums it very nicely. One of the dangers of working on the continent is you fall in love with it. Yes. And I say so from personal experience. But before I joined Sanlam, I was with Munich Reinsurance. It's a German company. I was there for 28 years. And we had a lot of expatriates, mainly from Germany itself. And I saw this. The guys would be scared of coming to Johannesburg. And we used to bring them over. We used to call it a look and see visit. And they would reluctantly come, bring the family, 2-year contract, renew it for another 2 years, and then the most difficult part was sending them back. And I remember one colleague actually resigned from the group and took up permanent employment here. So this continent, one of the things, I've lived in the States, I've lived in Germany. I'm originally from Zimbabwe, I've been here for more than 20 years. One of the things this continent has got, and I talk across all the countries I've visited, is the warmth of the people. You don't experience this anywhere else in the world. In Germany, it's almost like an unwritten rule, you don't speak to strangers. If you speak to someone you don't know, they take offense almost. On the continent, I travel alone most of the time. You stand at the bar in a hotel and you greet the guy next to you. Anyone who joins you in 30 minutes will think you grew up together. But you also have to be that forthcoming.
Of course.
It's the warmth of the people.
Absolutely.
And this also extends to business. I now have probably one of the finest collection of friends across the continent. I can land at any time in any capital city. I'll have 4, 5, 6, 7 people I can call anytime. And they do that when they come to Johannesburg. That human warmth is just incredible. And it also makes up for all the difficulties that you encounter in doing business.
Wow. I never looked at it that way. That's profound.
It's absolutely amazing. We have some of the most wonderful people.
Wow.
When people talk about Nigeria, you might even be scared of going to Nigeria from what you read and hear. Some of the finest human beings on earth are in Nigeria. Some of my closest friends I can trust with my life are in Nigeria. I think that's a very important point. And then I'll close by talking about the issue of, or the question of partnerships. I think the most important part is choosing, and Pete is right. From a Sanlam point of view, anyone who comes to me and says, I know the minister or I know the president, I'm not interested. I want a partner who is in business. I want a partner who's running a successful business, and preferably in the financial services, because then you are talking the same language. Then I also want a partner who shares the same values as we do as Sanlam, the same ethics as we do as Sanlam. It might take long to find that partner. We've been without a partner in Angola for a while. 2 weeks ago, I found the right partner. We are now in discussions how to proceed. Rather, take time, but find a partner who shares the same values and ethics as yourself. Not necessarily the guy who promises big connections, because those connections are transient. When they go, so does your business.
Wow. I repeat, feels like I'm in an NBA class. There was a microphone, my lady.
I hope I don't have to stand.
You don't have to stand.
My name is Jacqueline Zwabila. I'm a former diplomat and residing in Australia, but back home. And being a grandmother, but now saying, okay, enough of being a grandmother, but I think there's quite a lot I can contribute.
Indeed.
I've been going around this Africa Month to various, talks and things, but they've been mainly people-centered. So this is my first business, kind of one which I've attended. But I'm sure you're aware that the AU, the theme for this, and I think internationally too, is migrants and xenophobia. Which is a very big thing. And it's not necessarily only Africa, but international, because we have so many young people crossing rivers and being drowned just to go to the other side. And also in South Africa, across our borders, we have lots of migrants and people here, leading to what I want to talk about, xenophobia. I'm just going to I've got it all down so I don't digress. And get it right. A professor at one of the talks I went to from UNISA actually said xenophobia in South Africa is a misnomer, because xenophobia is about not liking people who are different color and everything, but what we actually suffer from is Afrophobia. The hatred of ourselves and the people who look like us, who are different but speak a different language. Why am I raising this on this platform? Because mega profits, dividends are being realized by South African companies in Africa. And which all come back to SARS, which all come back to be, to be part of the social fabric, hospitals and things. I think there's a huge corporate responsibility for companies like you, Sanlam, and others like yourselves, to actually be part of or assisting in that, assuaging the programs which are being done to actually try and diffuse the situation of Afrophobia in this country. And I'd like to know what your response is, if at all, that you are in programs with government, NGOs, to actually do something about this.
Thanks, Jacqueline. I guess CEO of Sanlam Pan Africa.
Yes.
you're the best person for this one.
It is really a tragic problem that we have. And we as traveling South African business people encounter the response, the questions. Why is it that when our people come to your country, they are treated as foreigners and they are abused every now and then? And it gets even more difficult for us as South Africans because pre-94, our liberation movements were housed in many of the countries. If you look at a country like Tanzania, you look at a country like Zambia, they actually literally sacrificed their economies as members of the frontline states to see to the liberation of the likes of Zimbabwe and South Africa. And it upsets them to no end that the thank you they get is that when a few of their nationals try and come and make a living here, this is what they experience. And when you talk of xenophobia, I've never heard of a Japanese experiencing a problem, or a Chinese or a German. It's us against us. That is the most difficult thing to answer when you're sitting in Lagos. What do you say? Because you are guilty as charged. I think it's something we as South Africans, our politicians, our civic movements need to put out there. Debate it if necessary. But I think we need the wider South African community to be aware that we are part of this great continent. We've gained and benefited, and will continue to do so by being part of this great continent. It's a question of exposure, and I like what the Prof is saying. The more of us cross the Limpopo, the more we will understand our fellow African brothers and sisters. It's going to be a generational issue. These are not simple problems to resolve, but I think it's something that really needs to be.
Has it come to you, has it come to your desk where there's an expectation for Sanlam in the 33 countries it operates in? And I think that's Jacqueline's question, for you to do something. And have you been able to do anything as a corporate?
Yeah, in country, like everybody else, we have a number of CSI initiatives where we give back. Most recently, we had Cyclone Idai. Our in-country partners donated money to those initiatives. We topped it up from here to distribute to the affected communities in Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. Those are small measures, but I think the bigger issue really is more the awareness, particularly here at home. Yeah. In terms of, it's an engagement issue. We do respond when we're asked what our views are, as I'm doing now. And also, one also has to, on a realistic basis, as a business, you have to do some things in a measured way. There are certain spaces where business does well, and there are certain spaces where we are rather clumsy as business. But we do take the effort, particularly being in a position to travel and engage.
Yeah.
I think that's more effective, engaging that side.
Yeah.
And we try and do that whenever we can.
Before I move on to, and I'm abusing your time, I know you're all supposed to be here at quarter two, so I'm going to take liberty because I'd like some coverage in the room for comments. Just before I take your comments, sir, I do think that we live in an age of disruption, Jacqueline, and since you come out of retirement now, as you've already admitted, there is a space I think is ripe for disruption, and that is corporate social investment.
Yeah.
Because as businesses, typically, we're not structured to do the meaningful stuff. The most simplest thing for us to do is to allocate a budget and donate. And it's the right thing to do. It's not a wrong thing to do at all. but it's been the same thing for the past couple of hundreds of years. So I would encourage you to start thinking about the right models that businesses like Sanlam can start implementing that makes the real change. Yeah. No. Yeah, of course. Yes, sir.
Oh, yes. My name is Stephen Selepe. I'm the founder of Telempilo Healthcare, which is a telehealth company, and we do cardiovascular and diabetes management. And part of that involves, which is the biggest danger that the continent is facing, by the way, more than HIV and AIDS and other conditions. Part of what we do is remote monitoring of patients. And we found ourselves after a few weeks, Pila, maybe too, you can help answer just how we can manage the risk. We found ourselves in a position where a decision by a president of a country out in the Americas through Huawei has really started to get us worried, because Huawei is providing sort of affordable, gadgets for our people that are under our management, and also some of the apps. And we found ourselves in a position where we are going to run into problems as soon as Huawei cannot provide those services. How do you think in the continent we can manage? How can we manage these risks that come from across the board?
Yeah.
In how they affect our businesses and also delivery of healthcare? Thanks.
Great question. Tough question.
It's a very tough. it's a very tough question. Number one, you have to realize that, especially when it comes to technology, the continent is a receiver of technology. The continent does not originate technology. So especially where you are using telecoms as an enabler of your business, unfortunately you will always be dependent to these two superpowers that pretty much own the technology. In the handset space, it's the Americans versus the Chinese. In the network spaces, where Huawei is at the moment, it's a Sweden, which is Ericsson versus the Chinese. In terms of what you can do, I would have to say you'll have to find a hedge in terms of beyond just Huawei delivering the technology. There are many other manufacturers of devices, but eventually, as long as the continent is a receiver of technology, we will always be at the mercy of the forces, because there is no device. There are devices that we assemble in a continent, but we do not originate the technology.
Right.
And the debate around the whole Huawei matter, it's a fight, the IP itself of the technology that Huawei has, and how it came about, and did somebody steal someone's technology, etc., etc. And as long as we are the receivers of what happens, whether it is Facebook or WhatsApp, you will always be at the mercy of the forces.
Absolutely.
How do you hedge against it? You can untechnology your business. You can't take it out of the technological space. You took the risk profile of entering that sector knowingly that South Africa does not originate and does not own the technology. And it's just as you literally have to move as the forces move.
And geopolitical shifts deserve a breakfast on their own.
Exactly.
Let me take the last question on this side of the room. PJ.
Thanks, Andile. This is working. My name is PJ Hope from PwC. We're very active and on the continent and looking to build a platform across the continent. My question derives from a session that was held actually here at Gibbs a while back on the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And there again, you've got cause for enthusiasm and cause for skepticism. And obviously, it's good news that we've now got 22 countries have ratified the agreement. The cause for skepticism is how far that agreement is going to proceed and how quickly in freeing up trade and investment across the continent. And so my question is, what can be done to deal with vested interests, bureaucrats, local business vested interests who like things as they are, and who are quite happy to keep that local market and access to that local market and keep the continent fragmented?
Prof?
Thank you for that question. You know, it's something I wanted to try earlier on. When you look at the AU, when the AU was launched in Durban, they were very, very clear. That's where NEPAD came about, that the project of economic development and integrating the continent was now very urgent, and correctly so, given what I said earlier on, that the original OAU was really about liberating the continent politically. So when you look at the AU now, what disappoints me, but I think that we should lobby for it, is that the AU must have a strong business sector summit. So people shouldn't be, only those who can afford it shouldn't be going all the way to Davos to try and have a word. At the AU summit, it must be preceded by a 2-day summit with the continental businesses talking about all of this. Otherwise, the AU is going to fall the way of the OAU. Then, I'm pleading for my sector as well. 1 or 2 of us also go to Davos, all the way to Switzerland, to talk about the role of higher education in developing our continent. We should have a guaranteed platform where even demands are made of us. Universities should increase their intake and train more people. We need more educated and trained people with a relevant changing curriculum. So the AU really needs to be coordinating all of the sectors of our continent, and most of all the business sector, and talking about all of these issues that impede trade, economic development, and integration. Yeah. Without doing that, essentially the AU becomes that organization that releases a statement nobody reads and no journalists publish.
Julia, I'm sure you've had some practical experience on the question.
No, it is a very commonly raised question. And I always say, I take my hero, when I think of heroes, is the African market woman.
The African market woman?
Yes. This is a woman, you go to Oshodi in Lagos, or any other market you find in the big cities.
Yeah.
You find women selling whatever they are selling. They raise their children. They send them to schools, sometimes universities. They don't complain that the road is not paved before they can go and sell in the market. They get up and do it. The road will ultimately get paved one day. Maybe by then she's got a bicycle. As African businesses, we have to think like the African market woman. We cannot wait until the conditions are perfect to do business. I can assure you, 33 countries is hard. I've got over 200 legal entities in my business. I got back from Cape Town last night. Since Sunday, I've been in planes for 38 hours. And yesterday I had my board meeting. It's hard. So you cannot wait until all the policies are in place. You cannot wait until the politicians shake hands someday and start to do what they're supposed to do. I think the future of this continent ultimately is going to be determined by African businesses. Ultimately, the politics of this continent is going to be determined by the African youth, not our generation of politicians. I think they're past helping us.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I've abused my license enough. I was supposed to get you out of here 10 minutes ago. Please join me in thanking our panel, and I'm going to hand over now to Adrian. Oh, I'm staying here. Okay, okay.
I'll take 1 minute of your time to please relax, to thank Andile for doing such a superb job in hosting this panel, and to our panelists. Your time is precious, it's valuable. It is a privilege to host you here this morning. I'm not going to try and do a job of summing up or wrapping up. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your calendars to be with us this morning, especially our CAM fellows. There's a number of you around the room. I guess the directive from here is fairly clear, if I take guidance from Junior and Ngulube. Go out, be African, and talk to strangers.
Thank you.